So let's talk about reducing the amount of items to show in a single view by aggregation and filtering. So we've already talked about how to handle complexity with three strategies: deriving new data to show within a single view, changing that view over time dynamically and interactively, and faceting across multiple views. So let's now get to our final strategy, which is reducing the amount of items or attributes that we show within a single view with filtering and aggregation. So when I say reducing, I really mean either reducing or increasing. These are actually inverses of each other. When we're doing this interactively, we're often deciding on the fly which direction to go. So what about filter? Filter just means throw things away. Don't draw them. That's for either items or for attributes. And what's nice is it's really straightforward to understand and explain. Computationally, it can often make things cheaper to compute. The downside is that saying out of sight, out of mind really is true. Even if you yourself have just turned off something with a filter, to try to make inferences about what you don't see in the context of what you do see is just a really hard and demanding cognitive task. So it's hard to reason about the things that are filtered out. The alternative is aggregation. How That's something where we, instead of just throwing things away, we somehow represent them visually, despite the fact that we have not just directly showing every single element. So what's great is this gives us a way to convey some sort of reduced signal about that entire set. The difficulty is it's hard to actually pick the right signal to make sure that what you care about is still visible even in the aggregated display. So these are not mutually exclusive. It's extremely common to combine filtering and aggregation. And in fact, it's common to combine all four of the strategies for dealing with complex data, which is deriving and reducing and changing and faceting. We often use those all in conjunction in a complex setting. So what are the design considerations with filtering where we're trying to eliminate some elements, either items or attributes? Well, the question you should ask is, according to what? What is the way to determine what to filter out? And really any way to partition the data set into two sets, the one to keep and the one to get rid of. So one way to do that, for example, would be pick attribute values that are bigger or smaller than some threshold value X. That's one way to filter, or that exactly equal some value Y. So we're trying to divide things into what we care about, the signal versus the noise. A note about filters versus queries: these are sort of inverse ways of thinking about essentially the same operation, and so we'll consider them together here. With a query, you start with nothing and you add things. With a filter, you start with everything and you remove things. And whether or not you want to think of things in either of those two modes depends often on the data set size. So if you have something enormous, maybe you have no hope to see it all and you have to start with a query. If you're able to have some sort of overview or summary of the entire thing, you can use that to guide your choice of how to filter down into something useful. So a classic example of dynamic filtering is the film finder idiom. And this was in the early days of actually doing this sort of showing everything all at once with an overview. In this case, it's a scatter plot of movies. Horizontal is the year it was made. Vertical is the popularity. And we see so many that we can't even draw the labels for all of them. And then on the right, we see that we've chosen a particular actor, in this case, Sean Connery. And so now we have much lower information density after we filter out everything that didn't match that query. And we're able to see the labels. And this kind of going back and forth between seeing everything and filtering down to a subset is what this sort of interactive filtering support is all about. So another example is cross-filtering. And this is something where we are trying to filter items across different multiple views. So we'll talk in another segment a bit more about the idea of histograms and scented widgets. But in this one, we've got little histograms above each of these controls showing the distribution of an individual attribute. And the thing we want to notice is how, when we change one, we see the others go with. So here's our interactive example. Notice how we have these histograms. And now what I can do is change the shorter versus longer delays, and then see how in those other histograms the distance and the time distributions change accordingly. The idea here is that by making choices in one window, we control the others. Notice how these histograms are actually being shown where as one selection happens in the filter, then we're actually only seeing partial segments. So we see both the part to the whole relationship between the selected one and the original. So now let's think about aggregation. So in this, we've got a group of elements that's going to be represented by some smaller number of derived elements. These are going to be proxies for that entire set of originals. And again, we can do that for either items or attributes. So an aggregation algorithm, idiom that surely you're all aware of is the histogram. You've seen this before, but let's analyze this with our structure. So this is an example of static item aggregation. It's perfectly suited for the task of finding a distribution. And the visual encoding looks just like a bar chart, but of course what's being shown is different. What we've done is we've taken a raw table of data and we have derived new data. And in the new table, the keys for that table are the bins we've chosen for the histogram, and the values are the counts of how many items in the original table fell into each one of these bins. Here we see an example of the weight of cats. And the thing to notice is the bin size is crucial. The pattern you see visually is going to change really dramatically depending on how you've discretized this into your bins. There is certainly some work in trying to find some algorithmic approaches, but fundamentally this is a judgment call. One thing you could do is give people interactive control over that. If you want to change this from a static aggregation to a dynamic interactive approach, you could give them, for example, a bin size control. Now, histograms are interesting because as we actually just saw in the previous example, this idea of adding a histogram to a slider, what is going on there? It's got this fun name of scented widgets that actually comes from the idea of information scent that came out of Xerox PARC work on information foraging, making this extended metaphor of animals looking for food and knowledge workers looking for information. And the idea being that an information scent could help draw you towards the useful and interesting parts. So Wes Jafar and Manish Agarwala argued that we could do something in a similar vein where instead of just thinking about a control as only being for interaction, we could combine basically a preview of what is the distribution of the attribute value that is controlled by that histogram. And this has proven to be actually quite a nice and powerful idea, where by adding a visualization into what you might think of as simply a region for controls, often in a very small and stylized way, without necessarily worrying about super high precision on your ability to read it, but to give you some sense before moving the slider of what might happen based on that individual attribute distribution. So let's take a look. Here's an example of scented widgets in a system from Van den Elsen and Van Wyk for complex network visualization. I'm not going to focus on that right now. What I want us to look at instead is that bit in the upper left corner, which I've zoomed in on here. And we can see that here's about a dozen attributes. We are using a very small amount of pixel real estate to show a bunch of these distributions, and those two little red triangles are by sliders' ability to just give a mix and a min and a max range. This is often how scented histograms are used. And we can immediately see there's some normal distributions, there's some bimodal ones, there's some categorical stuff, there's some power laws. And we're able to very quickly see that and make decisions about what might be a fruitful filtering range by seeing those distributions directly on the controls. Here's another example from Venture Corporate and also Van Wyk. And here we again see this idea that on the left are these histograms. We are actually controlling them with by sliders. So we are filtering in one attribute and we're seeing the result in the others. We have something similar to the cross filtering where based on the filter of one, we're seeing the part to whole relationship of the original versus the filtered attributes. So this has a lot of power and it's a way to really compactly show distributions. Let's take another example that surely you've seen before of static item aggregation, and that's a box plot. Again, very well tuned for the task of finding a distribution. And we again are deriving data. We take a table of the original data, and then we derive a new table. And it's a very, very concise table. We have only 5 quantitative attributes: the median, the upper and lower quartile, and the fences, to make these things that look like whiskers. Sometimes a box plot is called a box and whisker plot. And then we also explicitly show the outliers according to some criterion. The key thing to notice is the scalability is enormous. You could have 100 items or 1,000,000 items in your base table, and the number of pixels you would need to show this is invariant. So it's highly scalable. Of course, a great deal is getting aggregated out. And so this is an example of a concise representation that might help you decide, for example, which attribute to explore in more detail if you're using this in some sort of interactive linked system context or in some kind of exploratory data analysis loop. There's a great paper, by the way, linked to here from Hadley Wickham and Strajewski on 40 years of box plots that talks about the many, many, many variants of box plots that have been proposed to deal with some of these issues, like showing multimodal data and other things where core blocks plots are not able to show in as much detail. Okay, now let's start talking about some more exotic things with aggregation. We're still in the world of static aggregation, but now here's a nice proposal to deal with the problem of overplotting and scatterplots. So continuous scatterplots by Bachtaler and Weitzkopf is the idea that we would take a scatterplot and think, what happens if I have, instead of just 100 points, what if I had 100,000 points? And they were a lot of overplotting. In a standard scatterplot, you just can't see the difference. If there's a point, is it one thing there, 10, 100? They decided to propose an aggregation approach where you take the entire image that you've created and you treat that essentially in our analysis as a table. For each pixel value, so think of this as a matrix, where for each pixel you count the number of overplotted items there. And then what you end up with is a very dense, completely space-filling two-dimensional matrix, and you can encode that quantitative attribute of the density of the overplotting with a color map. And so in the color segment, I talk at great length about how if you want to have a multiple hues, you should actually order them by increasing luminance, and that's what they've done here, so that we can actually read off from the dark to the bright in an ordered way, but also get multiple hues. And what we see here is this could actually scale to millions of items, and they worry about the algorithmic issues and actually doing this quickly using the GPU. From an idiom point of view, what's interesting here is the way we've derived data by using the plotting process itself as part of deriving that quantitative attribute that we're overplotting. Now, aggregation is really interesting when it comes to spatial data. The cartographers have long known of what they call MAUP, the modifiable areal unit problem. And that is that if you change the boundary of a region, you get dramatically different result. This is sort of like that problem with histogram bins on steroids because we're in 2 dimensions, not just 1. So we can distinguish between what's called zone effects, which we're seeing here, from scale effects. So with the zone effect, that's at a given scale, it's changing the boundaries. And so here we've got yellow dots identically in the left, middle, and right. And we have color-coded these regions according to how many yellow dots are in them. And notice how we see wildly different pictures of what's happening. On the left, it looks like we've got a really dense region sort of on the right side of the center. And then in this middle picture, we actually see it doesn't seem to be nearly as dense there. Now we're seeing the dense regions looking like they're more on the upper left. And then in this picture all the way on the right, it looks like we don't have any particularly dense regions compared to any others because we've changed the place we've put our geographic boundaries. So wildly different visual patterns. We see a similar sort of a thing with the scale effects down here about when we're aggregating, I believe this is Indiana, according to a large grain spatial region or a much finer grain spatial regions. We see a very, very different picture and understanding of what's happening in this data set based on the scale at which we are doing this aggregation. Now, probably the most familiar to many people in the world in terms of where map affects real life is what's called gerrymandering, where political districts are deliberately made in a distorted way for the gain of one of the parties involved. There have been many great data journalism explanations since this pertains to all kinds of current elections. Here we can see an example on the right of a very non-compact region. So there are criteria for that you can try to optimize, just like with network drawing. There were often sort of criteria we could consider. One criterion for a region would be, is it compact? Another might be, is it representative in terms of fairness, as we see an example of here. So that's probably the place where spatial aggregation most is in everyday people's lives, but it's an issue that actually pervades a lot of issues of aggregation. And so the spatial one really brings it into the fore, but we often have to deal with some of the same problems, even in a non-spatial context. Now let's think about dynamic aggregation as opposed to just static aggregation. So one thing that's really useful when we're thinking about aggregating dynamically is the idea of clustering. And that's just classifying items into bins according to some sort of similarity measure. And hierarchical clustering algorithms can produce essentially an entire tree of these similarity relationships that we're going to call a cluster hierarchy. One common way to make these is a bottom-up approach called agglomerative clustering. You start with each node as a separate cluster, and then you try to find the two closest nodes to each other according to the similarity metric, add those together into a parent node, and you can do this iteratively until you get a full hierarchy. And then what's interesting about these hierarchies is we can use them with a lot of dynamic aggregation idioms because we can control the level of aggregation completely dynamically according to this hierarchy. Do we want few things or do we want to then move our way down the hierarchy to see more things? Now, the underlying reason this is interesting to do from a visual encoding point of view is we can assume that a cluster is going to be more homogeneous than the entire data set. And so some sort of measurements that we might want to visually encode or that we might want to reason about are going to be probably more meaningful because we can see how they differ between these various clusters. So any sort of a statistical measure or any sort of an attribute distribution is presumably going to be a thing we can compare between clusters in a useful way. So here's an example of how to extend this idea of parallel coordinates using this idea of a cluster hierarchy. So recall when we were talking about tabular data, that we said, oh, maybe if we have parallel coordinates, which remember are these jagged lines showing an item across multiple axes, maybe we could have hundreds of these in a standard 1000 by 1000 pixel display before we really start to have so much overplotting we just can't see anything. Here's an approach to handling it. This is actually, hundreds, tens or hundreds of thousands of these parallel coordinate jagged lines, where what we're doing is we are just drawing a cluster. We have a proxy for the cluster, which is that we're drawing through the mean of that cluster. We see the line, and then we're showing the min-max range of the cluster with this sort of transparency that is gradually falling off as we go from the center towards the edges. And what we see on the left is we're showing just one top high-level cluster. Then in the middle, we're changing which sections of the cluster hierarchy are visible by taking the top several ones, not just the very top one. And then we're able to see more structure. These min-max bands are decreasing in size because we picked more compact clusters, and we're starting to see some of the substructure on that leftmost region. And then on the right picture, we see substantially more clusters, but still far, far fewer than the entire data set of hundreds of thousands of elements. So this is an example that's actually used in many other dynamic aggregation situations of how a cluster hierarchy can allow you to dynamically choose an appropriate aggregation level. So we had been talking about item aggregation. What does it even mean to aggregate attributes? And the answer to that is there's an entire class of techniques called dimensionality reduction that are aimed at exactly this. And although we've been using the word attribute to talk about these aspects of data sets, right? The columns in a table. Typically, they're called dimensions in this sort of analysis that happens in a lot of different literatures, everything from psychology to machine learning to visualization. So what's going on here from the point of view of our analysis framework? We can think of this as aggregating attributes. And the idea is we want a new space that's compact and low dimensional, a target space, and we can get that from a high dimensional space. And the idea is this makes sense to do if you can't measure what you want to measure directly, that maybe you're measuring it in a very sprawling and non-compact way. And there's a way to actually capture almost all of the structure in those measurements using far, far fewer dimensions, or as we're thinking of them, attributes. So if you think you might have a data set where you know what every one of those attributes means, that's typically not where you would use dimensionality reduction. You don't use it if you have 5 attributes and they all have clearly defined semantics and you might want to directly investigate those. You would use it in a context where you conjecture, often in the machine learning literature, these are called latent factors or hidden variables, things you wish you could measure that you can't. So a classic example is, let's say you want to understand whether you've got a tissue, is it a tumor or not? Now, we don't just have instruments that let us measure, is it a tumor? We can measure all kinds of other things. And we can then try to see, if we say measure 9 different kinds of metrics on these tissues, that's a 9-dimensional measured space. We conduct dimensionality reduction and reduce down to just 2 target dimensions. Then we could plot every item in something straightforward, like a scatter plot is the very common thing to do. And now what have we done here? We're taking ground truth data where we know which samples are benign and which ones are malignant. And we're color coding according to that known class structure. And we're looking at this picture and noticing the spatial position of the dots on this layout in this scatter plot of dimensionally reduced data. Well, they appear to actually follow that class structure of benign and malignant. And so that means we could take unknown data where we don't know the ground truth, do this kind of dimensionality reduction and then clustering, and try to see whether we're still seeing these sort of cluster structures. Let's look at another example. It's very common in dimensionality reduction to use this for very large document data sets. And this is a great example of a chained task in visualization. So let's actually walk through this chain of tasks. So we start out and the so-called bag of words model for large document collections. You take a huge collection of documents, let's say we have 40,000 documents, and we check every single word that appears in any of the documents. And we make that the rows of a very, very, very high dimensional table. And then we count for each of these words, does it appear in a particular document? So our columns are documents, our rows are words, and it's a very large matrix. Let's say we have 20,000 words for our 40,000 documents. It's very, very sparse. There's no sense in just trying to look at this directly. But we wonder, is there some sort of cluster structure? So we create a low dimensional target space with attribute aggregation by dimensionally reducing from this high dimensional table down to just a 2-dimensional table. Then we go ahead and we plot this using a scatter plot, and we look at it for cluster structure. Then maybe in a third chained task, after we derive data and encoded that data, maybe now we go through and actually interact with it. We click on dots, look at the documents that they correspond to, and try to conjecture, what would be a good name for this cluster? You know, is it about Australian marsupials? Maybe I'll name that wombat. So we produce information where we annotate these clusters that are visible. Or we check some conjectured name, maybe trying to understand, is an automatically assigned topic actually correct given what's in the documents? So we've now walked through both filtering and aggregation as a way to reduce the amount of data that we show in a single view. And this is crucial when we get visualization situations where there's just no hope of actually drawing every single item. It's very, very common that data sets have far more items than even the number of pixels on a screen. We can't show them all at once, so we need to reduce.